All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 13, Section 4, addressing slavery. So, in terms of all the antebellum reform movements, this one is going to be the most important in terms of its immediate impact, with the Civil War looming on the horizon. But as like other issues in the country, temperance is a good example. It wasn't that slavery never existed, it's the fact that it's changing. Recall that with cotton, slavery is expanding kind of two ways. Expanding in terms of, we might say geography, right? Especially being pushed further south and further west, and expanding in just, numbers. The sheer number of slaves leading up to the Civil War is increasing. At the time of the Civil War, maybe 4.5 million enslaved people. So the urge to get rid of slavery, or at least to address it, becomes more imminent, right, as time goes by. Now, the important, or one of the most important groups here are the abolitionists. We'll talk about specifically what the abolitionist movement is. But we'd already talked a little bit about some of the ways that people began speaking out against slavery. We might call this anti-slavery. And this is kind of it's a very small distinction, but it's a distinction that I want to make. The difference between what we might consider an abolitionist movement, which is very particular to the era in the United States before the Civil War, versus somebody that we might consider to be anti-slavery. The textbook doesn't always stick to those terms in particular, but they are sort of separate. So some examples of what we might consider anti-slavery movements would be those who are in favor of colonization or those who are in favor of violence. We might also consider another sort of group into this equation that we talked about previously. That would be a religious group like the Quakers. Again, recall the whole purpose of the Quakers is not to get rid of slavery. They're a religious group, but their religious beliefs lead them to be against slavery. So we might sort of consider them as an anti-slavery movement. Other organizations we might consider anti-slavery would be the ACS, or the American Colonization Society. This is an organization that favored getting rid of slavery. But recolonizing, and we'll say that just because the term colonization, free blacks outside of the U.S. The ACS helped create Liberia, which was a colony in West Africa. This was a colony for free blacks and emancipated slaves to move to. Free blacks, say free slaves to move to. And this is one way that we would consider the colonization society different than the abolitionists. The abolitionists, as a movement, were not in favor of recolonization. So the colonization society had, in fact, a lot of popularity at this time. I would say that most people who favored getting rid of slavery wanted to get rid of it with the condition that people of African descent would not be living in the United States, that preservation of the United States as a white republic, and not open to anybody else. So it's not abolitionists in that sense. The abolitionists favor emancipating slaves, but also creating a biracial or multiracial society. But this was probably one of the more well-funded and well-supported anti-slavery organizations, essentially viewing slavery as a sin. It needs to be, gotten rid of in the United States, but really no intention of allowing those, free blacks to live in the United States, or, give them American rights, for example. Other people who we'd consider under this anti-slavery umbrella would also be those who favored violence, Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 is a good example. Nat Turner was a slave that led a violent rebellion that led to the deaths of a number of white people in Virginia. And David Walker, who was a free black in the North. Who also advocated violence. So with that being said, we can now kind of narrow down our definition of what, the abolitionist movement as a social movement in the antebellum era really is. And that will, we'll just sort of add these caveats to it, that the abolitionists want to integrate, that means to make part of, and extend rights to former slaves. And they also advocate for non-violence, right? Now, again, these sort of terms get kind of, these terms get sort of jumbled up together. But if you wanted to draw kind of a line between what separates the antebellum abolitionist movement and what would just be a general anti-slavery movement or anti-slavery organization, that pretty much is it. The abolitionists, looked at slavery as immoral. That was really what the justification was for getting rid of it. We might also add that it contradicted, U.S. values or American values. Expressed in places like the Declaration of Independence, the notion that people are created equal. And so you can see with that, if you look at it from a sort of perspective of Christianity, if you look at it from a perspective of, thinking about the United States values of equality, well, then it makes logical sense then to hold this view, right? That former slaves, that they truly are equal in the eyes of God. If, Thomas Jefferson's words are actually correct, then it means not just abolishing slavery, but also integrating former slaves into U.S. society and extending full citizenship and full rights. And so for this reason, and on top of it, we might also say that the abolitionists advocated for immediate abolitionism. That means to get rid of slavery, right now, right? Immediately, no compromising on it. And this also has to do with the point about, slavery being a sin. Very clearly, it's either right or wrong. And if it's wrong, you need to stop doing it now. In a sense that, other behaviors, the enslaving of people is like other sins. It's like, if we compare it to something like murder, it wouldn't make sense to say something like, well, I'll just gradually stop murdering people. That would still be immoral. In the same sense, slavery was immoral, right? It wouldn't make sense to just say, okay, we're going to gradually get rid of slavery. It needs to be gotten rid of now. And for that reason, the abolitionist movement was a small but loud organization. It was also, in some cases, one of the first multiracial movements in the United States, really bringing in a lot of different groups. It was men and women. It was rich and poor. However, one thing that did sort of make it, maybe not as broad, reaching, was that it's mostly in the North, right? It is mostly located in the North in some of the urban areas. Probably one of the most famous abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison. He was a newspaper publisher in the North. He wrote the Liberator. This was probably the most known abolitionist newspaper. And, like other reform movements, it, involved printing various publications to try and spread the message. Here we see an anti-slavery depiction here. It says, "Am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a woman and a sister?" And what the abolitionists sought to do was to really play on moral suasion. We might also say to appeal to emotion, right? That is to talk about the morality of slavery, to tell the story, to tell the narrative. It wasn't sort of a logical argument. It was to play on people's emotions, to talk and stress more on the morality of it. Again, like I mentioned before, Garrison and other abolitionists favored immediatism, right? That is to end slavery now, right? End slavery now. And we might think of, okay, well, what would be an example that contradicts that? Well, let's recall the idea of popular sovereignty, right? If that's a term that doesn't immediately come to mind, it's a good term to go back and review. Popular sovereignty, I'll do the hard work for you. Popular sovereignty is the idea of letting people vote on the legality of slavery. For the abolitionists, that's unacceptable, right? To even leave it up to a vote is still wrong. It needs to be gotten rid of immediately. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and some of the more, people who are in that camp may even refrain from politics, believing that that is corrupt. Garrison himself burned copies of the Constitution. He was very much a controversial figure, almost got killed in Boston for his views. But there were others who came to oppose slavery for different reasons. Maybe they were people who, maybe there are people who did not call for an immediate ending to it, but certainly had a perspective on it. Various political parties were created, the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party. These are anti-slavery parties. So for example, the Free Soil Party came to oppose slavery on purely economic grounds. So it really, the morality didn't really matter that much to the Free Soilers. They saw slavery as an impediment to the ability for white workers to earn wages. And so they created a different party as the second party system really became it just wasn't as effective of answering this particular question, right? The Democrats and the Whigs were in a tough position to try and find a position on slavery because they had members from the North and members from the South. So abolitionists, if they did participate in politics, through their votes in with either the Liberty Party or the Free Soil parties, these were third parties, so they weren't very popular, but they were a growing political voice really leading up to the Civil War. Some of the other strategies that the abolitionists used included creating abolitionist literature. It also meant sending literature to Congress. So much so that Congress actually passed a rule that prohibited the reading of abolitionist, petitions or whatever we may call the gag rule. You might say prohibited. Congressional. Getting sloppy here. Congressional conversation on abolition. And that was because, especially in this era, and especially leading up to the Civil War, slavery was that issue which threatened to tear the nation apart. For the most part, Congress could talk about tariffs and foreign policy and all these other issues without people, getting at each other's throats. But once the issue of slavery was brought up, then it was an increasingly uncompromised line between North and South. So, this was a small but loud group of people, the abolitionists were, and they were viewed as dangerous because they were talking about and bringing up the issue that could potentially tear the country apart. Abolitionists also had to face popular resistance. Elijah Lovejoy, he was an abolitionist. We'll call him news printer. He published an abolitionist newspaper, who was murdered by a mob, killed by a mob. And, he was considered to be a martyr, that movement. Now, in addition to William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass is arguably, I would say, probably the most well-known abolitionist. Frederick Douglass, who you see pictured right here, was someone who experienced slavery firsthand, right? William Lloyd Garrison, He was a white guy born in the North, had never been a slave himself. Frederick Douglass was a slave and wrote his accounts in what was called the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So this was a personal account of, uh, of slavery. Douglass became free. He dedicated the rest of his life to the abolitionist movement, and arguably is the most well-known abolitionist in the United States, really United States history. He also helped publish the North Star, which again was maybe not again, but the North Star, which was a newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper. And one of the most effective aspects of the abolitionist movement was these personal accounts, right? It was one thing for somebody like Garrison to burn copies of the Constitution and talk about the evils of slavery, but to see someone who experienced it firsthand and have them explain their own life account, that could play on people's emotions and really convince people in a way that that others who hadn't personally experienced it could.